Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Monday. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. So I'm Tyler Shores. I run the ThinkLab for the University of Cambridge, and this is one of a few more events that we'll be doing this year. We here at ThinkLab, we try to do a number of interdisciplinary events on big picture topics from all areas of knowledge, and certainly one of the biggest picture questions right now at the moment for many of us is AI. So we're super lucky to have Professor Naomi Baron from American University joining us to talk about a number of things, including her new book, Who Wrote This? I'll put a link in the chat if anyone would like to check it out. In the email that I sent everyone, I think this morning, there's an excerpt of the book from on the Stanford University Press site. I'm a little biased, but the book is very interesting, so well worth reading for anyone that would like to check it out. Quick bio, and then housekeeping things, and then we'll just kind of jump right into things. So Naomi Baron has a PhD in linguistics from Stanford University. Her research interests include language and technology, reading, first language acquisition, the relationship between speech and writing, the history and structure of English, and higher education, amongst other topics. She has published 10 books, some of which you might have heard of: Always On, Language in Online and Mobile World, Words on Screen, The Fate of Reading in a Digital World, back in 2015, which I love, by the way. That inspired me to do my own PhD writing, so thank you, PhD project, so thank you for that. More recently, How We Read Now, Strategic Choices for Print, Screen, and Audio from 2021, and more recently still, the book that we're going to be talking about a little bit today. Who wrote this? So, like, what are the pros and cons of AI in writing, and what else was I going to say about this? We have a number of discussion points that we wanted to cover. So I'm multitasking here with all the people coming. Welcome, everyone. If you could do me a favor and make sure that you are muted on the microphone, that would be excellent. We will make sure this is a very interactive session. So Naomi and I will have a chat about a number of topics, and we'll make sure that we have time for questions. If you've got questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll make the best use of our time that we can together. If any questions don't get covered, please do put those in the chat, and we'll try to address those too online to make sure that they're covered during this. So enough out of me. Welcome, Naomi. Thank you so much for joining us for this event. Would you like to start with a little bit of an overview of your book, and then we can kind of jump into some related topics that I know everyone is going to be interested in?
Sure. Thank you very much, Tyler, for having me, and thank you, audience and participants and questioners, for being here. A little bit of background on why I wrote this book called Who Wrote This? How AI and the Lure of Efficiency Threaten Human Writing. So you'll see in that title the word threat. You'll see the word efficiency. And as a person who's taught in the university, both in the United States for many, many decades and at various other places around the world, I'm very worried about what's happening with people's desire to know how to write, even in an everyday sense. I'm not saying everybody should become novelists or poets or philosophers, but rather knowing how to write, as so many authors have written over the centuries now, is a way of figuring out what you're thinking, of figuring out what makes sense, what doesn't, why you need to change your mind. Arguments have been made that Greek philosophy was able to arise in 5th century Athens because of the development of writing, which had started about a century and a half before then. And whether you believe that particular argument or not, it's very definitely true, so say many, 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 many writers, that writing is a tool for thought. And to the extent that we care, particularly in democratic societies, or in any societies for that matter, about how clearly we can know what we're thinking, we can rethink what we're thinking, writing is a tool for that. I have been interested in AI for many decades, going back to the mid-1980s, and when AI was sort of the new kid on the block in terms of public awareness. I mean, clearly, Alan Turing had been writing about intelligent machines from the late 1940s, early 1950s. But on the horizon where most people who knew anything at all about what was going on with computer science were, they said, well, there's a thing called AI, and I don't know if it's actually very productive or not, but what are the kinds of questions we could ask? As a linguist, I was extremely interested in the question of so-called machine translation, which was the major motivation in the United States anyway, during the late 1950s, early 1960s, for thinking about using computers in a, quotes, intelligent way, namely to translate, surprisingly enough, or not, between Russian and English. This was the Cold War, thank you. And when that initiative fizzled, because it was pretty clear it was too expensive and the results were too poor, and it was much cheaper to hire people who knew Russian to translate Russian scientific documents into English, a lot of people said, forget translation as a thing that a computer could do. And then it became clear as we got to better technology, better algorithms, that yes, you could do translation, and now you can do it not perfectly, but in a pretty impressive way. So let me stop at that point. There's so many other pieces to what I care about and what I've written about, but that maybe sets the stage of why a linguist would be interested, and somebody who cares about writing. And although I'm not a teacher of English composition or of creative writing, I've been teaching writing for decades in my classes. That's why I wanted to know what this new technology is about. I will say one last thing, and that is I finished the manuscript for this book and I sent it off to the publisher, Stanford University Press, about 2 weeks before OpenAI launched ChatGPT. So I needed to do a bunch of revision really fast before the book could come out. So the book is about, yes, there's generative AI, but not the sophisticated version that most of us know and either love or hate.
Thanks, Naomi. I was just going to comment and say like, oh, that's really good timing. And I was like, well, I don't know. Was it really good timing? It's timely for certain. But let's jump in. So I want to come back to that point about different disciplines, different areas of knowledge, because certainly this touches upon, we're talking about writing, we're talking about human communication and many other things. But we have a lot of university and academic folks here. There's a lot to talk about that are all encompassing themes, but let's start there since we've talked a little bit about that in terms of what do you see as the primary benefits and risks of incorporating AI into academic writing in particular, but more broadly into writing processes in general?
The first piece of an answer is it depends on which kind of AI you were talking about. We use the term artificial intelligence, AI, very loosely and say, AI, is it good? Is it bad? Is it going to have ethical implications? And on and on and on. We use artificial intelligence in all sorts of functions related to writing that we don't think of as being AI. If I say spell check to you, you say, well, that's pedestrian. That's been around for decades, and it has been. But the kind of spell check that Microsoft is now running, I am quite positive, is running on GPT-4, maybe GPT-4o, depending upon what they have spiffed up. Well, is that using AI? Is that not using AI? To the user, it doesn't look any different. But the mechanism by which the work is being done is for darn sure artificial intelligence. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is that it's way too early in the game for us to come to any kind of reasonable conclusions about what the benefits and the risks are of using, and now we'll talk about the more sophisticated generation for either research or for writing. So what do I mean by it's too early in the game? It's not just that ChatGPT changed our views of what it meant for a machine to be able to write, because machines have been writing since the mid-1950s. They've been writing love letters. A man by the name of Christopher Strachey used an early computer at the University of Manchester to write love letters. They were pretty cheesy, but it was generating new stuff, thank you. But the question is, what is it that we want assistance with? We used, in the old-fashioned days, we'd go to libraries, and I hope we still do, and use these things called books. Then we started using the internet. Well, we now have searches And do you want to call them search or do you want to call them generation? The distinction between them is a little vague. It's a question of whether there is new text generated from material that's available on the internet as to whether you want to call it generative AI or whether you want to just call it search. That we've been doing, and that's no big deal. The major benefit right now is that there's this humongous data set, at least for English, and growingly for some of the other, I won't say large languages because there are lots of people who speak Hindi, but there's not a huge data set for Hindi. But there's a huge amount of information out there that we would otherwise have looked to get some other place. And if generative AI can find things that we couldn't find ourselves, that's a benefit. It's a benefit that you can translate information, and I'll just call it information, but it could be literature for that matter, pretty easily. And it's not great translation, but it's sure better than nothing. In fact, it's much better than nothing. That is a benefit for anybody doing research and wanting to use documents in languages they don't know, and they can't get access to someone who does, or don't have the money to pay somebody to do the translation. Okay, what about the risks? Everybody knows about hallucination. Everybody knows about bias that is racial, bias based on gender, and those problems are not going away anytime soon. The real difficulty now, if you're talking about an academic context for research or research that's used for writing, is unless you check your sources, trust but verify, as we used to say during the US and then it was Soviet Union debates over what's happening with nuclear arms and control thereof. Unless you check your sources, you don't know whether something is accurate or not. And the same thing, by the way, is true for what you find in the internet. And as we used to say in the States, don't believe everything you see in print. And that was before anything approaching artificial intelligence of the sort we know about today existed. So a major challenge of AI in an academic setting, whether it's for doing research or for generating some writing, is it's so easy to trust what you're getting. It's so easy because the grammar is really good. The spelling and punctuation are perfect. They're much better than most human beings, even people who write for a living, would get on the second or third draft. Okay, so there's this algorithmic bias that says if these tools that people have invested billions of dollars in, if they're coming up with text and it seems to make sense, why shouldn't I trust it? And it takes a lot of extra effort to go track down, to double check each of your sources. And we have not done that for, forever in academia. We've tended to trust what we come upon. So there was an interesting comparison done a number of years ago between Wikipedia articles and Scientific American articles. And this was back in the day when academics, particularly faculty members, were saying, don't use Wikipedia, you can't trust what's in it. So the study that was done compared levels of accuracy in Wikipedia and Scientific American articles. And guess what? Wikipedia was more accurate. Encyclopedia Britannica has errors in it. I mean, these things happen. So we're used to saying, well, a few errors, well, that's not going to harm us. And we're used to it anyway. And by the way, if Microsoft paid $13 billion to OpenAI, surely it's going to be accurate, right? Well, no, but we understand human nature to say, maybe it's okay. And besides, I'm really busy and I have to get on to the next thing.
That was a lot to cover. That's a very interesting number of things that I want to dig into just a little bit more. One of which, Naomi, since you mentioned kind of like checking sources and kind of more of the diligent things. So I noticed just from the list of attendees here that a lot of us are teachers and interact with students.
Right.
So how can academics and teachers and educators more broadly kind of work on that to ensure the ethical use of AI and student writing, knowing that, kind of like you've already alluded to, the on the one hand, we've got a little bit of the moral panic, I suppose, in terms of like, Google is a form of, like cheating and plagiarism. Now Wikipedia is, and now GPT is, but not singling out any general universities, but like, universities in general, we've got a lot of work to do. Like, I think we're well past the point now in terms of just don't use it for plagiarism. And it's like, what else? How do we evolve? Evolution is a slow process, but how do we kind of evolve with the shifting technology? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. First, let me draw a distinction between cheating and plagiarism. Plagiarism is theft of somebody else's words. If you steal a paper from somebody else, or you look over during an exam at somebody else's exam book, back in the days when people wrote by hand, that's theft of somebody else's words. If I pay somebody $200, or, let's make it 120 pounds or whatever you'd like. I don't know what the conversion rate is these days. To write a paper for me, I haven't stolen something. In essence, I've done the equivalent of license it. So that's not actually theft, but it's cheating. So the very first thing that universities have to think about is this distinction between theft and cheating. And if they're writing, honor codes or codes of ethics or whatever, they've got to get the language right, or else some smart student is going to call them out, okay, or wiggle out of a charge. Okay, the second issue is, at least in the United States, where I know much more of what's happening than I do in the UK or other parts of the world, universities are, at this juncture, very confused, and rightly so, about what kinds of policies they should have. So I'll take a simple example. Recently, this was back, I think, in November or December, when it was time, if you wanted to apply to law school, you had to get your application ready. And there was one law school, and I believe it was the University of Minnesota, but don't quote me on it. It was somewhere around there. Said, thou shalt not use ChatGPT or any generative AI to write the essay that you need to submit with your application. In the same application season, a university, I believe it was Arizona State University, which does lots of AI things, said, for your essay, you're welcome to use anything you want. All right, so you have law schools that have different policies. Every university I know of in the United States, every college and university, is struggling with the question of, so what do we do? To what extent do you have a university-wide policy? To what extent, particularly for private schools, which have much more, which give their faculty much more autonomy than public state schools do, do you let the individual faculty member make the decision? Do you do it by department? Do you do it by university? And those are decisions that have to be made, along with, so within each context, what does that level person decide? What's pretty clear is that from the practices of the last year, now that ChatGPT has been out in the wild, as it were, for a little more than a year, there are very different decisions being made. There are a lot of people who are saying, okay, if you can't, as we'd say in the States, if you can't lick them, join them. If this thing is going to be around, you might as well figure out how to use it. So there are lots of people giving assignments of the following kind. You, student, write an essay or a term paper or whatever, and then run it through something like ChatGPT. And there are other versions of it. We'll just call it ChatGPT for simplicity. And then let's talk in class together about what the differences are between what you had originally done and what was recommended. Okay, the alternative is flip it. You give a prompt to ChatGPT. You say, write me a 2,000-word essay on, in the United States, the origins of Memorial Day. Okay, it's Memorial Day today. And then you, the student, get to critique how you would have written it differently. And then you come to class and you talk about it. Those are good things to do. One of the games that I played when I was quickly redoing parts of my book, because now ChatGPT was out, was you ask the same exact question more than once, and you get different answers. My favorite example of this was asking whether if something is written by ChatGPT, it can get a copyright in the United States. And UK copyright law and American copyright law are pretty similar. You know, the US basically piggybacked originally on UK law. There are little differences, but they're very similar. US copyright law absolutely positively says that something generated by a computer may not get a copyright or a patent for that matter. However, when you ask the question the first time, when I asked the question the first time of ChatGPT, it said, well, if it is new material and it's of some value, and that's part of copyright law, it has to be new and it has to be of some value, then yes, it's copyrightable. The second time I asked exactly the same question, it said, no, by US law, you cannot get a copyright. So what was happening is different parts of the data set were being accessed when I asked the question the first time versus the second time. And this is a learning experience. So there are positive things you can learn. Okay, now going to the, how do you ensure ethical use? Ethical presumably means if you say you wrote it yourself, you really did. This is another, it's a slippery slope, and it's one that, by the way, science journals are coping with. There's some science journals that are saying, thou shalt not use any generative AI to do research and do any of the writing. There are others that say, or that now say, they used to say no, and now they're saying, well, it's here. So you have to acknowledge what's used. So one way to look at what's happening in classrooms is to have students acknowledge, this is what I wrote, this is what was written for me, this is what I did with what was written for me, and to make that a dialogue, first with the student himself or herself, and then between the student and the faculty member. So that would be my best advice to start that ethics chain going. But the next thing that's critically important, and it's in part of the other prompts that you suggest I might want to think about, is the really most important thing we can do, above all else, is educate ourselves as people who are teaching in universities and educate students about what are these technologies, what can they do, what are their strengths, what are their pitfalls, what's likely to change next week. So if I had some way of having sort of a simple blog that somebody wrote that summarizes what are the new things that happened in the last week or the last 2 weeks that you need to share with students about what's new that's out there that you need to share with the faculty. Because this is such a moving target. There's no way to say, this is what we do now, and we've solved the problem.
Yeah, so there's a number of a wealth of topics there. If anyone online has comments, feel free to write them in the chat, or we'll make sure that we have a good amount of time. I want to dedicate at least a quarter of our time to question and answer, so we'll make sure everyone gets covered here. Maybe someone can remind me, but I feel like I just saw AI verification checks on Instagram. It's either Instagram or TikTok now, but at least for me, maybe it's not for everyone, but you have to click a box now that says, it's like, yeah, I certify that this was not AI generated for during certain posts and things. So that's new, but I could imagine seeing those sort of things built into platforms more often.
That's new and that's nice. And do you trust? I hereby affirm that I did it myself. Well, let's look at levels of honesty. Take your favorite format. You want a politician. I can think of some in the United States you all have probably heard of, and tomorrow he'll be back in court. Right? Then the question of if there's a minimum age before you're allowed, in principle, to sign on to Facebook or to sign on to Instagram, or to sign on to name your favorite social medium. And you've got people who are clearly underage saying, yes, I am this age, or yes, my parents agreed. There's no check on whether that's true or not. So, the idea of, or take something like watermarks in terms of, was this thing AI generated? Was it not AI generated? Well, depending upon which research you read, watermarks are going to be our salvation. And the US Congress seems to think they're going to work. But you talk with computer scientists, you talk with the AI people who are doing the work, and what they will tell you is the chances of watermarks actually being able to tell you whether something was AI generated or not are not so great. And unless you harmonize across all the systems what kind of watermarking you're doing and have somebody who knows how to read that watermarking, then it's a game we're playing rather than actually being able to say this was AI generated or it was not. So I'm not so optimistic. Similarly, you take things like GPT-0, which Edward Tian created very soon after ChatGPT came out. And that's how he, as a Princeton student, spent his Christmas vacation. And the tool has gotten much better. Is it foolproof? Absolutely not. And there was a time when tools such as GPT-0 would peg essentially non-native speakers, in this case of English, who didn't have really strong language skills as having cheated by using in that case, ChatGPT. And why was that? Because the way the system works is it predicts what the next likely word, what the next word most likely will be, and high frequency words are those which are predicted most often. And if you don't have this vast vocabulary because you don't have, name your favorite number of years of education in English, then you tend to use the simpler words. And Edward Tian says we solved that problem. Maybe he has, maybe he hasn't. But you talk with AI researchers, and they're pretty convinced the time either has come or will come when we cannot discern. And if you'd like people to raise their hand and say, yes, AI generated, that's great. And either that's true or not. Either it is AI generated and they admitted, or it's AI generated and they didn't. We're not going to know. And we have to resign ourselves to that. We have to say, that's not a game we're going to win. We would like people to be honest, but it's not a game we're going to win in terms of having the tools, the AI tools, be able to tell us.
It's an interesting thought, actually. It would be neat to get a little bit of a temperature check from everyone in terms of where do you think, like, what are your feelings? What are your experiences for everyone listening, both now and in the future online for the recording? Like, how do you feel about some of these things? Like, what's your gut instinct on that? I think you're totally right, Naomi, that, first of all, I really like the reverse engineering assignments and these sort of things to give to students in terms of like, yeah, teaching needs to evolve to keep pace with these like fairly dramatic changes in terms of like how things are assessed. That goes for a number of purposes. Talking about going one level up for the universities themselves and other companies. So I have a little story. I can't say what university because then people will say I'm gossiping, but ask me later and I'll tell you. So there was a department that was hiring for someone, hiring for a new kind of like, fancy title lecturer and like, generative AI and all of these things. They ultimately went with the candidate who, I don't know. So like someone who recent and had a slow history of, a scholarly production is like an article here and there. And then recently in the last 12 months did 20 in a year. But I think their reasoning was who better to teach the students than someone that's actively doing it. And I was like, oh boy. Yeah, I'm coloring my story a little bit, but like we might see more examples of that in terms of like, hey, the best hackers often get employed by the government and like the big money jobs because they're really good at using these tools and exploiting the systems and all of these things. So I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. Other than we'll see more things like that.
Okay, but without your specific story, there's some research that's recently been done by some people at Stanford and elsewhere, trying to ascertain how much of academic articles, particularly in computer science and engineering, is now being written by generative AI, as well as how many reviews of proposals sent to AI conferences are being done by AI rather than by the human who was assigned and agreed to do the review. And the numbers are scary. So I'm just reading from it right now because I just read the paper. 17.5% of computer science papers and 16.9% of peer-reviewed stuff that we write as peer reviews had at least some content drafted by AI. That's big. And one of the other sort of sub-findings is the people who, and particularly for doing the reviews, seem to be using AI the most, that is more than the average of 16.9%, are the people who were late in getting their, to doing their reviews, and they didn't bother writing clear comments and ample comments, and they weren't willing to read a revised version and that kind of stuff. That is, there's people who just wanted to get the job done. And one of the clear concerns is that the number of articles that are being written now, particularly in computer science, is growing and growing and growing. I mean, the number of journals has been exploding even before generative AI came along. So the more papers you get out, the better chance, not just for your story, but for anybody else, better chance one has of getting a position or getting promotion and that kind of thing, or getting more salary. And these tools are way too tempting, and they're going to be used. And they're used heavily by the people who know how to use them in artificial intelligence, and the engineering folks probably are almost as good as well.
What about in your own personal workflow? Any interesting examples? I think your book has got a couple of fun and interesting ones about how, and I fully admit, it was like, well, I use it in my daily workflow for a number of things. I would personally pay for Tyler GPT for do my emails and things that I don't want to do. That would be amazing. But what about yourself, either from examples from the book, but how is AI, like impacted? Any interesting examples, good or bad, in terms of like what you've noticed for your own work and creativity and writing process?
Well, I'll talk about myself in a second, but if you don't mind, I'd like to tell a story that
Yes.
you and I, before the session started, I told a vague version of. Because it's the same kind of thing that I see elsewhere in my own teaching experience. Okay, this is a story that actually appeared in the Times Literary Supplement in January, I believe. And in an article written by a professor of Russian literature named Eric Nyman, who teaches at the University of California at Berkeley, not exactly a slouch school. Okay. And he writes, in 30 years of teaching at Berkeley, I have read thousands of undergraduate essays, but until recently, I didn't think any of my students ever used the word delve. As I read their compositions on the brothers Karamazov this past fall, however, I saw that things had changed. So here are some examples of what the students wrote in their essays on the brothers Karamazov. One student, this essay delves into the themes of masculinity by focusing on two central figures, Ivan and Alyosha Karamazov. Another student writes, Dostoevsky delves into the destructiveness of obsessive passions. A third student, this novel is more than a family saga. It delves into the existential and societal crises of 19th century Russia. Okay, if delve had never been used in any of the essays. I mean, it's a fine word, but it hadn't shown up. What happened here? Well, I'm sure what happened is there's some small number of essays, books, articles, whatever it is, on the brothers Karamazov in the English data set that ChatGPT or one of its cousins searched, and they all found the same article that used the word delve. Okay. That's a problem. So that's the kind of thing that, particularly if you're teaching, I mean, it's not exactly a niche subject, but to some extent it is, it's Russian literature, and particularly the brothers Karamazov, will stick out like a sore thumb. Okay, so you can find it. The problem is, most cases, you have a broader data set that's being drawn from and you can't find it. So now I'll tell the story of my colleagues who teach translation. I'm in a department of world languages and cultures, and many of my colleagues teach translation with Spanish or German or French or Russian or Italian and so forth. And their challenge for a number of years as Google Translate got better, and as Microsoft Translate now takes lots of text, you can put 30 pages into Microsoft Translate in one go, and it will translate the whole thing for you. So if you're teaching translation, how do you know who did the translation? Some of my colleagues say the only thing I can do is have them do their translation in class with a hardbound dictionary. No computers, you got to sit in class and translate. Well, that's not a very viable way of using class time. The more innovative of my colleagues have done some version of what I just described, for write an essay in English and put it through ChatGPT, and then we talk about in class what the differences are. So this particular colleague who teaches Spanish translation spends a lot of time talking about what is it that humans do as translators? What is it that computers can do? What is the difference? One of the things in my book, going back to that issue that I didn't talk about, is if you ask translators today what it is they like about doing translation, it's getting inside the skin, as it were, and this is mixing metaphors, of another culture, of another language, of trying to figure out how could I say so let's just say in English, when the book was originally in Italian, how could I say things that convey the nuance of what's in Italian? And computers are not doing that now. They are actually translating literature, something we thought 30 years ago would never be possible. They're now being used in literature, but translators are very unhappy. They're unhappy for two reasons. One, because you're missing the art of translation. And secondly, because the people who are commissioning translations realize they will save huge bundles of money if they do more and more of their translation with automatic translation or machine translation. And then you hire the human translator to just clean up a little bit, to be the post-editor. Now, going back to one of the questions about what's happening in academic settings with academic writing, my concern is that we are relegating most of us as writers to being post-editors, not to be writers. And we already know what translators have to say about the horrors of degrading the art of translation. The same thing, and now the jobs are basically, we used to laugh, sweeping up after the elephant, that's your job. Okay, so now it's just sweeping up after the machine translation has done its work, or after ChatGPT has done its work. And all we're doing is prettifying around the edges. So going back to that essay on Memorial Day, instead of just taking exactly what ChatGPT said, I'll add some local color. I'll say, here in Washington, they tend to have a parade. They don't, but they tend to have a parade down Constitution Avenue. And I went as a child and blah, blah, blah. So that's the kind of thing that humans are going to be increasingly tempted to do. This is that law of efficiency I had in my subtitle. And these all come together as a single set of challenges.
See some questions coming in from the audience. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, let's get into it a little bit if you're ready, Naomi. I like this one. At the beginning, you spoke about writing as a mode of thinking. I was wondering whether you could reflect further on this.
Sure. I'm just trying to figure out how far I want to go on it. All right. If you look at the way, and I'll just talk about the United States because it's all I really know. If you look at the way writing is generally taught, it's, well, first you have to learn how to read and then how to write, and maybe you switch the order a little bit, whatever. But the basic goal is learn how to use a wider vocabulary, learn how to use wider set of syntax, learn how to do argumentation. In the United States, something ridiculous called the 5-paragraph essay was created. Mercifully, I was in school before that happened. And it basically says, this is how you construct an argument. You need an introduction, and then you need 3 arguments, and then you need to sum up. Okay. But if you wanted to do anything useful with these writing skills, you do what we tend not to teach, but that I won't say any, but many, 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 many serious writers know. And that is, writing is a struggle. Writing is something that you don't just get right the first time. What is my students' penchant? To do a first draft, and that's also the final draft. And what I work on them with is saying, how would you, if you were the lawyer on the other side of a case, how would you argue against this? Did you proofread this? Does this sentence follow from the one above it? I don't think so. What would be the issues? And to talk that through. And you sort of urge people to then take writing as a form of thinking. So what is it that writers such as Joan Didion, who has written about writing as a way of thinking, and I don't know what I think until I see what I have written. The Southern writer from the United States, Flannery O'Connor, said the same thing. George Bernard Shaw said something very similar. And each of them really was capturing the fact that, at least if you're in a literate society, this is not to say people who are non-literate societies don't think, but rather it's to say you have an opportunity to rethink, to reassess, to question, to challenge. When we read someone else's writing, we do that. We say, wait a second, I'm not sure I agree with that. Or that's right. And now let me think back my own experience, why I agree it's right. So that's using writing to prime, someone else's writing in this case, to prime your own thinking. There was a book written many decades ago by a classicist named Eric Havelock called Preface to Plato, in which he argued that one of the things that writing did for basically 5th century BC Greece was it gave you the opportunity to contemplate what someone else had written or what you had written and to rethink it, to make yourself work through it, to say, I don't know, I have to think about this, and maybe come back to it a week later or a month later or a year later. I mean, just as we go back and reread a book and we were really convinced of the argument 5 years ago, and then we read it and say, this is garbage. So you're rethinking in the process, even if in this particular case it's someone else's writing. I hope that gives at least a broad range of possible answers to the question.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing you say too is also that kind of those shortcuts through the writing process, the writing is thinking process, kind of miss the point, right? So it's like the Woody Allen joke with I took a speed reading course and I read War and Peace in a couple hours. It was about Russia. Yeah.
It's about Russia.
Okay. Wrong, it's about France too. But yeah, but like it misses the point, right?
So just to add a little bit of research to the discussion, there have been studies done that show if you're given some text that is generated by, let's just call it ChatGPT for simplicity, and then you're given the opportunity to make changes in it, to make changes in the argumentation, to make changes in the syntax, to make changes in the vocabulary. Educated users in this experiment were prone to say, no, I don't have to change anything. Looks good to me. Because it looks polished, it looks done. And one of the advantages of doing our own writing, if we actually go back and edit it ourselves, is we see it doesn't look done after a first draft, particularly if you give it overnight or a week and then you come back to it, you say, this sentence is ridiculous. I don't even know if I believe it. So the act of going back to something that you generated, because you know you're not perfect the first time out of the gate, is a way of spurring the thinking. And we also know that if something is, with today's AI, generated, it just looks so good. You say, I couldn't improve on this. No, go for it.
Another question from the audience. I'm gonna summarize this a little bit. I have grad students coming to me saying, I need help editing this ChatGPT output because I don't know what it means. I was like, that's interesting. Follow-up comment is that in my own editing practice, I found that ChatGPT overuses the word focus. So my objection is similar to yours. It sounds powerful, but it's not because it's analytically vague. So interesting. The second part interests me too, because it kind of brings out, is there going to be a homogenization of all of our writing sounding like ChatGPT? Are you worried about that?
The answer is yes, and there are some reasons for it. First, let me give an example of this focus issue, and then let's talk about the snake swallowing its tail in terms of data. In part of this research that was done on use of, that's roughly 17% of the reviews done of proposals for premier AI conferences. One of the things picked up on was particular adjectives that were used, and the use of these adjectives in reviews of proposals for these conferences skyrocketed after ChatGPT came out. So what were the adjectives? Commendable, innovative, meticulous, intricate, notable, versatile. Okay, so that's sort of in a way like focus. They're sort of vague, and these adjectives were not used with anything like the frequency before the tool came out. So what is my concern regarding the possibility of homogenization? When you read the AI literature today, people will tell you we're running out of sources of new data. And the biggest source of new data we have, because we've already slurped up everything on the internet and various other archives and so forth, the biggest source of new data is text generated by AI. So what we're now doing is AI searches on a data set that has lots of AI generated text, at least some of which is full of words like focus and meticulous and versatile. And to the extent we use these materials, there is every probability that language would become more homogenized. Now, that said, somebody's going to get smart and realize that what you have to do is feed in a lot of data to the data set that has some low frequency words, and that has words maybe from other languages that we now stopped using because we don't want it, we just want to speak English, thank you. So raison d'etre, you're not allowed to use anymore. Reason, okay, you're supposed to use. But you could create a data set that has a bunch of these things if you wanted to make it look more linguistically sophisticated. But it's still not human language.
Okay, I will get to Priscilla's question. Thank you for asking this in a second, but let me pick something out from the book because I think this will broaden us out into a larger discussion of creativity. So in one of your chapters, you talk about, basically AI and creativity. So I really like this question here about, can humans distinguish between AI and human-generated literary compositions? It's one of the things that you post in this, and then I'm still making up my mind on that kind of question. So that's a good question in itself. And then taking that a step further. So, and I mean, relatively recent, I guarantee this is going to come up, and shocked it hasn't come up already. How about Charles Dickens' bot? How about, so I really like Charles Dickens, his unfinished novel, Mystery of Edwin Drood, for example, and I was like, would I read something that was programmed that had all the Dickens writing that exists and has been recorded, and then gave a best guess of the finished novels? Like, maybe. I'm still making up my mind about these things. Anyways, but the main question is about AI, human creativity, and can we still tell the difference between something written by a machine and a human author?
Okay, so there are actually a bunch of questions with that. Can we tell the difference? One is, can the naive reader, even someone who really likes Dickens and has read all the real Dickens novels, can you tell the difference? I don't know. What I do know is there are a number of very well-known authors who are mad as hell and won't take it anymore because they have brought lawsuits because their work has been fed in to data sets and to large language models, and new stuff is being generated as if they had written it. So they are more worried about their style being taken from them. And that is another issue. We know that in certain areas, it's sort of easier to figure out, sorry, it's harder to figure out whether something is AI generated or not. So take the project for what was called the Next Rembrandt. And it was a project, this predates modern generative AI, but the tools were around for doing this kind of thing earlier anyway, where you take the works of Rembrandt and then you create a new portrait that Rembrandt didn't paint, but in principle he could have. And you don't know whether he painted or not, because there are various paintings still discovered from people's attics and basements and whatever, and they turn out to be genuine. Okay, and figuring out in the art world whether something is fake or genuine, fake, it used to be painted by a human being, but fake, and now painted by AI, it's very, very hard to discern that. Okay, the same thing is true of things like Bach fugues. Bach wrote so many fugues, and the formula for doing a Bach fugue is actually comparatively simple. And because there were so many, maybe there's another one, in addition to the 100 or 200, whatever it is, maybe there was a 202. And here it was, someone found it. Now, when it comes to writing, I'd really love to believe that for really good creative writers, we'll be able to figure it out. But most writing, let's be honest, you look at the New York Times bestseller list, you're not going to be able to tell. Because unless there's something that's really distinctive that didn't get into the data set, you're not going to know. And that troubles me, because my conclusion in that chapter on AI and creativity is that it's less important whether we can tell whether something, whether it's writing or whether it's art or whether it's music, whether something was created by AI. What's important is the creativity coming out of us for our own well-being as individuals and as societies. Because we look at people who've been creative in many different ways. Leonardo da Vinci is the example that I give in the book. And we care about who was that human being who could have done what he did. And it's his humanity that matters in some ways as much to us as the Mona Lisa does. And if you don't know, and you say, since I don't know, I can't care about this person because I don't know if this is a real person or not, we lose something of what society has cared about when it comes to creativity, that this is something humans can do. It's partly what makes us human. Both for the sense of our individual souls, as well as for our culture, feeling there's something we produced as a culture. We look as archaeologists, we look as art historians, and we say, this is something that Renaissance Italy produced. Let's see how that can happen. How could it happen again in modern times? And if you don't know if a human being did it, then what happens to that cultural advantage that comes to us for knowing it was a human?
Yeah, thank you for all of that. Got a couple more questions. I think we can fit these both in. Priscilla, hi, I see you on video. Nice to see you. Would you like to ask your question live? That'd be easier. We can do the chat, whatever you prefer. I can read from the chat here.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Good
Hi.
morning.
Hello.
I'm Priscilla Santi. I'm from Peru, Lima, Peru. Well, I have never written a paper yet. How could you describe is the process? How can I start doing that? I would like to become a teacher for kids who have special needs.
Okay, so I wasn't able to hear, I'm sorry, the first part of your question, but I know that you want to become a teacher for children with special needs.
Yes.
Okay.
Kind of talking about, sorry, Naomi. The first part was kind of like just writing papers in general for people who are still new to this. And I was like, I think Priscilla, correct me if I'm wrong, asking about how can you describe the process? Like, where does one start? How do we do that?
How do you do it? Well, you either get the free account or you pay $20 a month, US dollars, for the more sophisticated tools, and you put a prompt in and you say something such as, would you write me a poem about cherry blossoms? And then you wait a minute, and then a poem about cherry blossoms just materializes on your screen. Or you ask the question, could you tell me the difference between cheating and plagiarism? And it will give you an answer. Maybe it's an accurate answer, maybe it's not, but it will type things out for you. Or you say, I want you to write, I want to know why there was the solar eclipse a couple of weeks ago, but write it such that a 10-year-old would understand. And it will write in the kind of language that a 10-year-old would understand. Or you ask the same question, explain what a solar eclipse is, and write it for a nuclear physicist. And it will give much more sophisticated language because of that person's training. Okay, so the tools can do all this now. They can say, if you say, I have children who are having who have a low IQ, but they can still read. So please write, so I'm thinking about children with cognitive special needs, write in a way that a person who has an IQ of 85, if 100 is in principle average, you can only go down a certain level before that person probably can't read, and then it can go up higher. Write it for a person with an IQ of 85, and it can do that. I mean, maybe it doesn't do it well now, but by next week or next month, it will be able to do that. The other thing that AI can be really useful for is working as a one-on-one tutor. So there's a man named Salman Khan who started something called the Khan Academy a number of years ago now to help give lessons to, I think it was his nephew or some relative. And now it's grown into a huge enterprise, and you can just put in Khan Academy and get lessons on all kinds of things. One of the things Salman Khan is now working on, and I think he's working with either Microsoft or OpenAI or both, but don't quote me on that. He's working with one of the main companies, is a tool called Khan Amigo, Amigo friend. And it's a personal tutor. And what it does is it learns what you know and what you don't know. It doesn't give you the answers to questions. It rather does what a really good patient teacher does, namely help you figure out the next step in the thinking process to get to the answer. So I'm imagining, depending upon what kinds of special needs we're talking about, that can be really helpful. So let's say you have someone who has attention deficit disorder and doesn't have a lot of patience. Working with that child or adult sometimes can be really tiring. Computers never get tired. Or let's say you have difficulty maneuvering your hands. Let's say you have cerebral palsy and you have difficulty moving things. And there are all kinds of devices now to help people with cerebral palsy use a stick to write on a keyboard. But maybe there are more sophisticated ways, given AI technology, to do that. And I'd like to believe that there are people who care about the kinds of kids you would like to be teaching, who are working on technologies to help make learning, to help make enjoyment, to help make games more accessible to them.
I quickly want to add to that the best description that I've heard from someone who uses Chat GPT fairly often in their writing is thinking of these tools as like a conversational partner, which I think is really good and useful for the writing process. So the more, in my own experience, the more specific you can get, the better in terms of like, all right, so I'm thinking of writing an article on Chat GPT and literature and these sort of things, and I want the audience to be people who like reading the New Yorker and New York Times and these sort of things, but I also want to bring in like a little bit of history and philosophy. What do you think about that? And then it's a little bit of magic in terms of what it comes up with, but it is just a start. So like it can't do the work for you, but it can certainly give you ideas in terms of like, huh, hadn't thought about that. Okay, let me try something with that. So it doesn't, like Naomi's been saying this whole time, like it doesn't replace our creativity in writing, but as a tool to aid some of these things, it's pretty neat.
So let's, if I might, compare that with having a good, smart friend with whom you like to talk about the projects you're working on. So you say, I'm thinking of writing an article on such and such, and I don't even know where to look for background. You knows about these things. Can we talk together? And that person gives you some suggestions. Is that different from what ChatGPT does? Not necessarily. I mean, there's no simple line you can draw to say, okay, that's ChatGPT and this is a human being giving advice. Or you write a first draft of an article and then you give it to a friend or colleague and you say, tear this apart for me. Tell me what's wrong. Tell me how you should do this differently, whatever. Give me some sense of the things that I haven't read. Give me suggestions. When I do reviews of articles or books that have been sent to me, where journal publishers or book publishers send me something, I give them suggestions on articles they should look at, on issues they should think about. So is that different from what ChatGPT is doing? The issue is there's a continuum. So the big watchword in AI land is augment, don't automate. And to augment is to collaborate. To augment is to have a conversational partner. And that all sounds good, but knowing at what point this is still yours, as opposed to it's no longer yours, you've gone over that slippery slope, is sometimes hard. I tell a story in the book about an author named Jennifer Lepp, who writes books for she posts them on Amazon. She writes a new book about every 6 weeks. They're paranormal cozy books. Don't ask me to give the details of what this genre is, but it's a specific subgenre. And she started using a tool called pseudo-write that was powered by GPT-3. Okay, what OpenAI does is that it licenses its products to all kinds of people to go use for other functions. But it's sort of like a baby ChatGPT, if you will, and is used by lots of writers, students including, by the way, even before ChatGPT came out. And at first she would just want some descriptions of scenes or that kind of thing because she's writing an awful lot to get these books out. That's how she makes her living. And what she noticed over time is that she was letting the tool pseudo-write write more and more of the text for her. And she finally reached a point where she said, I don't recognize this as mine anymore. So what is that point? It's really hard to draw the line, and different people will have different amounts they're willing to have generated. So if you're writing these novels that you want to get out every 6 weeks, I'm sure there are people who are having the entire novel written, and maybe the author, that's in square quotes, reads through it once, but the novel is basically written by ChatGPT, but under the author's name, and you're not needing to give royalties to anybody else because it's not plagiarism and it's not even cheating. Many books are ghost written. Just ask Donald Trump and The Art of the Deal. He did not write that book. And lots of people do not write the books that have their name on the cover. They don't even have the name of the ghostwriter on. So that's not new and it's not cheating. I mean, maybe you paid the $20 a month, so you paid for your product. But I think it's an issue of, number one, conscience, as to where we individually draw the line. And it's also an issue of reflecting as a society, what is it we want human beings to know how to do, to force themselves to think? When I have to sit and write by myself and come up with a new sentence, it's hard. And I may come up with 5 versions of it and then throw them all out and say, I can't do this. And then I come back and I say, okay, let's try again. But that is good for my brain. That makes me think. You know, just as it's said with foreign languages, use it or lose it, or knowing how to ride a bicycle. If you don't keep using these skills, after a while, you can't. That, you know, one of the big discussions today is that of de-skilling. De-skilling if you're a journalist, de-skilling if you're a lawyer, de-skilling if you're a student, by the way, of saying, well, if I don't practice this skill, after a while, I just don't know how to do it anymore. My spelling skills were never terrific, but I lived with a dictionary. I lived with a dictionary, you know, Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, everywhere I was, one in my office, one in my house. My spelling skills have gotten incredibly worse, thanks to Microsoft Spell Check. There's no question about it. And there's a question of which of those skills do we think are worth keeping? And those are decisions we have to make as individuals, as school systems, and as societies.
It's a good reflection to kind of bring us closer to the end. I know we're over time, Naomi. There's one final question from David, which I really like. Thanks, David, for sharing this. I'll read this aloud. So going back to basically what we've just been talking about, like writing as a form of thinking, that deep reflection. So what David writes here, that deep reflection in human thought is a really striking point. It sounds like that is one of the things that might be at risk of being lost with full adoption of AI. How do you think we can protect or champion those deep reflection spaces in an AI world? Good question.
Okay. There's a term that's used all too often, at least in the United States and maybe in the UK or other parts of the world, critical thinking. Okay. And actually, the concept was created years ago by mathematicians. And it was a notion for how do you think through a mathematical, particularly mathematical logic. And then the term has been bandied about. And if you're in an American university, every dean or president or provost who's welcoming the new crop of students at the beginning of the year says, we're going to teach you critical thinking. All right, I've read most, or at least a good chunk of all the literature written on critical thinking, and we have not a clue what it means. You know, presumably you're supposed to be able to analyze. Well, if you're not doing a lot of reading, you don't have a lot of material to analyze, to think through. So this goes to the larger question of how do you encourage people to use their brains themselves rather than have some tool do it for them. And we have to say as a society that we care about it. And if we don't care about it, then it's not that we're going to stop thinking entirely, because there's certain kinds of things we need to think about. And somebody's got to create the next generation of AI tools. But we're going to lose our edge. You know, there are lots of people who worry a lot that democracy is at risk. Now, one of the questions I used to ask myself is, what do you have to know to be a voter? Well, in principle, you should know what the issues are. You should know the pros and cons. You should be able to make an informed decision. What do you need to know to be a member of a jury? You may be deciding whether somebody goes to jail. You may be deciding whether somebody lives or dies. And just hearing the evidence, having no understanding of how you think through an argument, is going to make for some people who don't deserve to go to jail or don't deserve to die to have bad things happen, or people who are really guilty to get off scot-free. So to function in a social context, you've got to be able to think things through. Writing helps that. Writing helps you be critical about how you analyze things. You could do a lot without writing. The big debates about whether non-literate societies think the same way that literate people do. There are lots of people who are literate who don't do a whole lot of thinking. Many millions voted for a particular former president in the United States. On that political note.
On that note, I think lots to think about, lots to be optimistic out and think about and figure out together. So that's the other thing, is that these are changes happening right now as we're talking. So it's a thrilling time. I'm glad, Naomi, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your time and thought on a number of these things. Thank you everyone for joining us on a holiday in some places, and hope you have a good rest of the day. We'll post the recording on YouTube if you'd like to share it with any friends and colleagues. And I've shared Naomi's book in the chat, first couple of chats there, so feel free to grab that. And I think we can wrap up. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for a great chat, Naomi. Thank you for joining us, and looking forward to the next chat we can have, next event.
Thank you all.
All right, everyone. Have a nice morning, day, and evening.